Have you ever hated someone, only to realize they had been quietly changing your life for the better all along? That question never crossed my mind during my first year at Mercy General Hospital because I was too busy being annoyed with Lucas Bennett. Every Sunday evening, I checked the weekly schedule posted outside the nursing supervisor's office, and almost every single week I found the same thing. My evening shift was gone. My name had been moved to a daytime rotation, and Lucas had somehow taken the overnight assignment instead. The first time it happened, I assumed it was an administrative mistake. The second time, I thought maybe someone had requested a favor. By the fifth time, I was convinced Lucas was doing it on purpose. I simply could not understand why. Lucas had worked in the emergency department longer than anyone our age. Patients trusted him immediately, doctors respected his judgment, and new nurses practically followed him around, hoping to learn something useful. Calm, reliable, and impossible to rattle, he handled 12-hour overnight shifts as though they were ordinary afternoons. Everyone admired him. Everyone except me. From my perspective, he was the coworker who kept interfering with my schedule without asking. Every time I planned a quiet evening after work or signed up for a specific shift, something changed before the schedule became final. Somehow Lucas ended up working the hours I had originally selected while I was quietly reassigned somewhere else. It did not affect my paycheck, and technically I never lost hours, but that only made the mystery more frustrating. Why would someone volunteer for the most exhausting shifts over and over again? During one particularly busy Monday morning, I finally asked our charge nurse whether the scheduling software had a problem. She looked at me with obvious confusion before saying, "No, Ryan. The system has been working perfectly." I frowned. "Then why do my shifts keep changing?" She hesitated for just a second before answering. "You should probably ask Lucas." That answer irritated me even more. If Lucas wanted my shifts, why could he not simply tell me? The emergency department never slowed down long enough for private conversations. Ambulance doors opened every few minutes. Monitors beeped steadily throughout the halls. Overhead announcements echoed from one end of the department to the other, and nurses hurried from room to room, carrying clipboards, medications, and endless cups of coffee. Somewhere in the middle of all that organized chaos, Lucas always seemed completely composed. More than once I caught him quietly offering to stay an extra hour so another nurse could make it home for dinner with their family. He never complained. He never expected recognition. He simply stepped in wherever someone needed help. Everyone praised his generosity. I saw something different. I saw the man who somehow always managed to rearrange my schedule before I even knew it had changed. Late Wednesday afternoon, I walked toward the staff lounge intending to grab a sandwich before my next patient arrived. As I passed the scheduling board, I stopped so suddenly another nurse nearly walked into me. My name had moved again. Friday night's shift, the one I specifically requested 2 weeks earlier, was no longer mine. In neat black letters, someone had written Lucas Bennett beside it instead. My jaw tightened. Enough was enough. I turned toward the emergency department, determined to confront him before another shift disappeared without explanation. What I did not know was that discovering why Lucas kept taking my shifts would force me to question every assumption I had ever made about the quiet man everyone else seemed to understand except me. Lucas was exactly where I expected him to be, moving calmly through the organized chaos of the emergency department as though the constant alarms and endless stream of patients were nothing more than background noise. He carried a clipboard in one hand while quietly answering questions from a new nurse who looked overwhelmed only halfway through her shift. Every few steps someone called his name. A physician needed lab results. A patient requested another blanket. A family member wanted an update. Lucas handled every interruption with the same steady patience that somehow made everyone around him breathe a little easier. Watching him should have reminded me why people respected him so much. Instead, all I could think about was the schedule board. I waited until he finished speaking with the new nurse before walking over. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked. He looked at me with his usual calm expression and nodded immediately. Of course. We stepped into the quieter hallway leading toward the staff lockers. The sounds of the emergency room faded just enough that we could hear each other without raising our voices. I crossed my arms before speaking. "Why do you keep taking my shifts?" Lucas blinked once, clearly surprised by the question. "Your shifts? Do not pretend you do not know what I am talking about," I replied. "Friday night. Last Sunday. 2 weekends ago. Every time I request an evening shift, somehow your name ends up beside it instead." For several seconds, he simply looked at me. I expected excuses, maybe even an apology. Instead, he quietly asked, "Has it caused you any problems?" The question caught me completely off guard. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" he asked gently. "You still receive the same number of hours. You have not lost overtime. The schedule has always been approved before it becomes final." I frowned. That still does not explain why. Before Lucas could answer, an overhead announcement called his name to Trauma Room 3. He glanced toward the emergency department before looking back at me. "I am sorry," he said sincerely. "Can we continue this conversation later?" Then he was gone, disappearing through the automatic doors before I could stop him. I stood alone in the hallway, feeling even more frustrated than before. His response had answered absolutely nothing. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of patient charts, medication rounds, and endless documentation, yet my thoughts kept returning to the conversation. Lucas had not denied changing the schedule. He had not acted guilty either. If anything, he seemed genuinely confused that I considered it a problem. Near the end of the evening, I stopped by the scheduling office again. Most of the lights were already off, but the weekly calendar remained pinned neatly to the bulletin. Bored. This time I looked more carefully instead of focusing only on my own name. A strange pattern slowly emerged. Lucas was not taking random overnight shifts. He was taking mine. Every single exchange involved hours I had originally requested. He never replaced anyone else's schedule, only mine. My pulse quickened as I traced the handwritten changes from previous weeks. There were too many to dismiss as coincidence. Just then Melissa, one of the respiratory therapists, walked past carrying a stack of patient files. She noticed me staring at the board and smiled knowingly. "Trying to figure it out?" she asked. I turned toward her immediately. "You know something?" She hesitated for a brief moment before answering. "I know enough to tell you that if I were you, I would stop assuming Lucas is the villain in this story." Before I could ask another question, she continued down the hallway, leaving me alone with a schedule that suddenly felt less like an annoyance and more like the beginning of a mystery I had never expected to solve. For the next several days, I could not stop thinking about what Melissa had said. If Lucas was not the villain in the story, then why did nobody simply explain what was happening? The question stayed with me through every patient assessment, every medication round, and every shift report. The more I watched Lucas, the less my original theory made sense. He never behaved like someone trying to make my life difficult. Quite the opposite. Whenever the emergency department became overwhelmed, he quietly moved wherever help was needed most. He stayed calm with anxious families, encouraged exhausted coworkers, and somehow remembered the names of every new nurse who joined our unit. Even after working 12 straight hours, he still found the energy to help someone else before thinking about himself. It was frustrating because none of those observations explained the schedule. Friday evening finally arrived, and although Lucas had officially taken my overnight shift, I remained in the hospital for mandatory training that lasted until almost 8 o'clock. By the time I left the education center, the emergency department had already shifted into its familiar nighttime rhythm. Ambulances continued arriving beneath flashing entrance lights, while the waiting room slowly filled with people seeking care. I should have gone home, but curiosity refused to let me leave. Instead, I stopped at the staff lounge overlooking one of the main nursing stations. From there, I could quietly observe the department without interrupting anyone's work. Lucas was already halfway through the shift that was originally supposed to be mine. He moved efficiently from room to room, occasionally checking patient monitors before stopping to reassure worried relatives waiting outside treatment areas. There was nothing dramatic about the way he worked. It was the small moments that stood out. He noticed when another nurse had skipped dinner and quietly handed her half of his sandwich without making a big deal about it. He stayed a few extra minutes with an elderly patient who looked frightened even after everything medical had already been explained. More than once I saw him volunteer for another task before anyone had the chance to ask. I found myself wondering how someone could carry so much responsibility without ever appearing resentful. As I continued watching, our scheduling coordinator entered the nursing station carrying next month's preliminary calendar. She placed it beside Lucas, who briefly looked over the pages before pointing towards several open overnight shifts. The coordinator nodded, made a few notes, and walked away. My curiosity immediately returned. As soon as she disappeared into another hallway, I quietly approached the station. "Working on next month's schedule already?" I asked as casually as possible. The coordinator smiled, trying to get ahead for once. I glanced toward the clipboard before pretending to read one of the staffing notices nearby. My eyes quickly found my own name. 3 overnight shifts I had requested were marked with small handwritten arrows. Beside each one appeared Lucas's initials. My heart sank. It was happening again before the schedule had even been finalized. Lucas noticed where I was looking, but said nothing. Instead, he simply picked up another patient chart and headed toward room 12 after offering the coordinator a quiet thank you. He never looked guilty. He never acted secretive. That somehow made everything even stranger. As I turned to leave, the coordinator called after me. "Ryan, you know Lucas always submits those requests before anyone else, right?" I stopped in the hallway and slowly turned around. "Before anyone else." She nodded without realizing how much those simple words changed everything. If Lucas had been planning these schedule changes weeks in advance, then whatever reason he had was far more intentional than I had ever imagined. That night, I stayed longer than I needed to, pretending to organize supply cabinets while my mind remained fixed on one question. Why would someone deliberately volunteer for my overnight shifts weeks before the schedule was even finalized? The answer seemed close enough to reach, yet every clue only made the mystery deeper. Around 11 o'clock, the emergency department finally settled into a quieter rhythm. Most of the critical cases had been stabilized. Families spoke in hushed voices throughout the waiting area, and the steady hum of medical equipment blended into the familiar soundtrack every hospital employee eventually learned to ignore. I carried a stack of patient charts toward the staff records room, intending to file the last of my paperwork before heading home. The records office was almost empty, illuminated only by soft overhead lights and the glow of computer monitors left running for the night team. As I placed the charts onto the counter, I noticed a thin folder resting beside the scheduling computer. Across the top, someone had written shift exchange requests. I had no intention of looking through confidential paperwork, but one page had already slipped halfway out of the folder. My own name caught my attention immediately. Ryan Walker. Below it appeared a list of dates stretching back nearly 8 months. Every single request had the same handwriting. Lucas Bennett requesting voluntary shift exchange. One after another. Week after week. Month after month. There were far more requests than I ever imagined. I quietly counted the first page alone. 14 exchanges. The second page listed even more. None of them had been assigned by management. None had been random scheduling adjustments. Lucas had personally submitted every request himself. I stared at the papers, unable to understand why anyone would willingly take so many overnight shifts without ever mentioning it. Just then the sound of approaching footsteps echoed outside the records room. Startled, I carefully returned the folder exactly as I had found it before stepping back into the hallway. It was only one of the overnight administrative assistants delivering additional paperwork, but my heart continued racing long after she passed. As I walked toward the employee elevators, I noticed Lucas sitting alone in the small break room with a paper cup of coffee growing cold beside him. His shoulders looked heavier than usual. For the first time since I had known him, exhaustion was written plainly across his face. He rubbed his eyes for a brief moment before opening a notebook filled with handwritten patient notes, reviewing every detail with the same careful attention he gave at the beginning of each shift. There was nobody else in the room. No audience. No supervisors. No reason to keep working so hard except that it seemed to be part of who he was. I almost walked in to ask him the questions filling my head, but something stopped me. Instead, I remained quietly outside the doorway for only a few seconds before continuing toward the elevators. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. As I poured coffee in the staff lounge, one of the senior nurses glanced at the schedule board and smiled. "Lucas switched again," she said casually. "Good thing, too." I looked up immediately. "Good thing," she nodded while stirring cream into her coffee. "He always seems to know which people need a little extra help, even when they never ask for it." Before I could ask what she meant, her pager sounded, and she hurried away toward the intensive care unit. I stood there holding my coffee without taking a single sip. For the first time, I stopped asking why Lucas kept taking my shifts. A different question had quietly taken its place. How had he known exactly which shifts to take before I even realized I needed someone to take them? The question stayed with me for the rest of the week. Every time I walked past the scheduling board, every time I saw Lucas calmly finishing another overnight shift that had originally belonged to me, I found myself searching for an explanation that made sense. None of them did. If he wanted extra overtime, he could have picked any available shift. If he wanted recognition, he certainly never acted like someone looking for praise. Whatever his reason was, it was personal, deliberate, and somehow connected only to me. Late Thursday afternoon, I was helping discharge a patient when one of the hospital volunteers stopped me in the hallway. "Your grandmother is doing much better today," she said with a warm smile. I thanked her before continuing toward the nurse's station, but after only a few steps, I stopped completely. My grandmother. Almost no one at Mercy General knew she had been recovering from heart surgery over the past several months. I had kept that part of my life private because I never wanted coworkers worrying about me or treating me differently. Aside from my nurse manager, only Human Resources had documentation explaining why I occasionally requested specific evenings off for medical appointments and rehabilitation visits. Yet somehow that volunteer had known. Before I could think about it further, Melissa walked over carrying a patient chart. "Everything okay?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "How many people here knew about my grandmother?" Melissa looked surprised by the question. "Not many. Your manager, Human Resources, and..." She paused for a second. "Lucas." I stared at her. "Lucas. He only found out because he accidentally overheard your manager talking with Human Resources several months ago. He asked whether there was anything the team could do to help without making you uncomfortable." My thoughts froze. Why would he ask that? Melissa smiled gently. "Because that is exactly the kind of person he is." I shook my head in disbelief. "He never said a single word to me." "That was intentional," she replied. "He told your manager that if you wanted people to know, you would tell them yourself." The hallway suddenly felt much quieter despite the steady activity surrounding us. Melissa continued before I could interrupt. "Your manager originally wanted to publicly ask for volunteers to swap shifts whenever you needed time with your grandmother. Lucas asked her not to." "Why?" I whispered. "Because he said you would probably refuse if everyone knew the reason." Those words settled heavily in my chest. Suddenly, every schedule change looked different. Every overnight shift. Every weekend exchange. Every moment I thought someone had been making my life more difficult. Melissa glanced toward the emergency department where Lucas was helping a patient into a wheelchair before speaking one last time. "He made one request," she said softly. "He asked that nobody ever tell you he was the one volunteering. He wanted you to have the time, not the guilt." I looked through the glass doors toward Lucas. He was laughing quietly with an elderly patient who had finally been cleared to go home, carrying her discharge papers as though it was the most ordinary part of his day. There was no sign that he expected anyone to notice what he had done. No hint that he wanted appreciation. For months, I had mistaken quiet kindness for interference. Now I was forced to face a truth that felt almost impossible to accept. The man I believed had been taking something away from me had actually been giving me the one thing I could never have given myself. More time with the person I loved most before it was too late. For the rest of that day, I could barely focus on anything except the conversation with Melissa. Every memory I had carefully arranged over the past year suddenly shifted into a completely different picture. The frustration I had carried for months now felt painfully misplaced. Every time I thought Lucas had been interfering with my life, he had actually been protecting a part of it I never realized he understood. Even so, one question refused to leave my mind. Why me? Mercy General employed hundreds of people. Nurses swapped shifts every week for countless reasons. Why had Lucas quietly carried my burden without ever expecting me to know? Late Saturday evening, I found myself scheduled for one of the few overnight shifts that Lucas had not exchanged. The emergency department was unusually calm compared to most weekends. Soft conversations drifted through the nurse's station, while the steady rhythm of cardiac monitors echoed gently from nearby rooms. Shortly after midnight, I stepped into the small staff lounge to refill my coffee. To my surprise, Lucas was already there, sitting alone beside the window with a notebook open in front of him. Steam slowly rose from a cup that had long since gone untouched. He looked tired in a way I had never noticed before. Not physically exhausted, but quietly worn down by something much deeper. He glanced up as I entered and offered the familiar polite smile that suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. "Long night?" he asked. I nodded. "Not too bad so far." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The comfortable silence felt strangely unfamiliar after everything I had learned. Finally, I took a seat across from him. Can I ask you something? He closed his notebook without hesitation. Of course. I searched for the right words, unsure how much he already knew that I knew. Why do you always volunteer for everyone else? He smiled faintly. Because someday, I might be the one who needs someone else to volunteer for me. It was such a simple answer, yet it somehow revealed more about him than an entire speech could have. I looked at the notebook resting beneath his hands. Do you ever think about yourself? He laughed quietly, more than people probably believe. Before I could respond, his pager sounded. He glanced at the screen, excused himself, and disappeared back into the emergency department with the same calm efficiency he always carried. As he walked away, I noticed the notebook he had accidentally left behind on the table. I had no intention of opening it. I simply picked it up to return it when a folded appointment reminder slipped onto the floor. Instinctively, I reached down before anyone stepped on it. The card landed face up in my hand. Physical therapy appointment. Every Tuesday morning. 6:45. I frowned. Lucas had never mentioned physical therapy. Before I could read anything else, he returned to the lounge. His eyes immediately dropped to the card in my hand before lifting back to my face. For the first time since I had known him, genuine surprise crossed his expression. I quickly handed it back. I am sorry, I said. It fell out. He accepted the card with a small nod. Thank you. There was no embarrassment in his voice, only quiet appreciation. He slipped both the card and notebook into his bag before offering another gentle smile. Some stories are easier to tell after people stop feeling responsible for them. Then he walked out once again, leaving me staring at the empty chair across the table. I had finally discovered why Lucas kept taking my shifts. Yet somehow, every answer only uncovered another layer of the quiet life he had spent so carefully hiding from everyone around him. After that night, something inside me quietly changed. I no longer looked at Lucas as the coworker who had complicated my schedule. Instead, I found myself noticing all the things I had ignored for months. He was always the first person to arrive before an overnight shift, usually carrying the same worn travel mug filled with black coffee. He stayed after everyone else left if another nurse needed help finishing documentation. He remembered birthdays, asked recovering patients how they were doing when they returned for follow-up visits, and somehow managed to encourage every new employee without making it seem like a lesson. I started wondering how I had spent an entire year seeing only the one thing that frustrated me while completely missing everything else. The following Tuesday, I intentionally volunteered for an extra evening shift, hoping our schedules would overlap long enough for a real conversation. The emergency department remained busy throughout the afternoon, but by early evening the steady flow of patients finally eased. Lucas was updating charts near the nurse's station when I walked over carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee from the hospital cafe. I was getting one anyway, I said, placing the second cup beside him before he could politely refuse. He looked genuinely surprised. Thank you. I smiled awkwardly. You usually do this for everyone else. I thought it was your turn. A quiet laugh escaped him. I suppose that is fair. We worked side by side for nearly an hour afterward, reviewing discharge paperwork and organizing medication records. For the first time, the silence between us felt comfortable rather than uncertain. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to speak. Melissa told me about my grandmother. Lucas stopped writing for just a moment before setting his pen down. He did not look angry or embarrassed, only thoughtful. I was wondering when someone might mention it, he admitted softly. Why did you never tell me? I asked. Because it was not my story to tell. His answer came without hesitation. You trusted only a few people with something that personal. I respected that. I looked at him, searching for words that suddenly seemed impossible to find. You spent months working extra overnight shifts because of someone else's family. He gently shook his head. Not because of someone else's family. Because a good nurse should take care of coworkers the same way they take care of patients. I frowned slightly. Most people would have asked for something in return. Lucas smiled faintly. Then maybe most people were taught differently. Before I could respond, the overhead speakers announced that a patient transport team had arrived. We both stood automatically, ready to return to work, but I stopped him before he reached the hallway. There is something else I never understood, I admitted. Why did you always keep your distance from me? For the first time, Lucas looked away instead of answering immediately. His calm expression softened into something far more vulnerable. Because everyone in this hospital believes I am the dependable coworker who solves problems without making them personal, he said quietly. The moment people start believing I help someone because of how I feel instead of because it is the right thing to do, they stop seeing your accomplishments and start creating stories that are unfair to both of us. His words settled heavily in the silence between us. I had spent months believing distance meant indifference, when in reality, it had been another form of protection. As we walked back into the brightly lit emergency department together, I realized the greatest misunderstanding between us had never been about the schedule. It had been about all the quiet feelings Lucas had hidden so carefully that even I, the person standing closest to them, had never noticed they were there. Over the next 2 weeks, nothing dramatic happened, yet everything between us quietly changed. Lucas no longer avoided small conversations whenever our paths crossed in the emergency department. Instead of simply exchanging patient reports, we occasionally spoke about ordinary things while restocking supplies or organizing medication carts. We discovered that we both preferred early morning coffee over energy drinks, that we both enjoyed quiet weekends instead of crowded restaurants, and that we had both chosen nursing for surprisingly similar reasons. Neither of us had entered medicine because it seemed exciting. We chose it because helping one person at a time somehow made difficult days feel meaningful. Those conversations were never long, but they stayed with me long after each shift ended. One rainy Thursday evening, the emergency department experienced one of those rare quiet hours that seemed almost impossible in a hospital. Most patients had already been admitted or discharged, monitors beeped softly in distant rooms, and nurses finally had enough time to complete paperwork without rushing from one emergency to another. Lucas and I found ourselves organizing storage cabinets together in the supply room. The silence felt comfortable, broken only by the sound of labeled boxes sliding neatly onto metal shelves. "Your grandmother is doing better," Lucas said with a small smile. "I am glad." I looked at him in surprise. "She asked about you last weekend." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Me?" I nodded. "She remembers the evenings I suddenly had extra time to visit. She kept asking what changed." I smiled softly before adding, "I finally told her the truth." Lucas looked down for a moment, almost embarrassed. "She thanked you," I continued. "She said kindness is easy when everyone is watching, but the kind that asks for nothing in return is much rarer." For several seconds, Lucas remained completely quiet. Finally, he gave a small laugh that sounded almost shy. "She sounds wise." "She is," I answered. "She also told me I should stop pretending I cannot recognize when someone genuinely cares about me." Lucas slowly closed the cabinet door and leaned lightly against the shelf. Grandmothers usually notice those things before everyone else. I took a slow breath before asking the question that had quietly stayed in my thoughts ever since our conversation in the staff lounge. "When did you start caring?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the rain tapping gently against the small window in the supply room. "Your first week," he admitted at last. I stared at him. "My first week." He nodded. "You stayed nearly 2 hours after your shift ended because an elderly patient was afraid to be alone while waiting for transportation. Nobody asked you to stay. You simply noticed he was frightened." I barely remembered that evening. "You remembered that?" "I remember a lot more than I probably should," he said with a quiet smile. "After that, every time I saw you putting everyone else before yourself, I started wondering whether anyone was making sure someone looked after you too." His honesty left me speechless. Everything I had believed about Lucas over the past year continued falling away piece by piece. He had never been quietly judging me. He had been quietly noticing me. Before either of us could say another word, the overhead speaker announced that a multiple patient ambulance arrival was only minutes away. Instantly, the peaceful moment disappeared beneath familiar urgency. We hurried back into the brightly lit emergency department without another conversation. Yet as our eyes briefly met across the nurse's station, I realized neither of us needed to say anything more. Some truths had finally become impossible to misunderstand, and for the first time since we met, the distance between us no longer felt like something either of us wanted to keep. The weeks that followed felt lighter in ways I had never expected. Nothing about our jobs became easier. The emergency department remained as unpredictable as ever, with long hours, constant movement, and patients who depended on every member of the team. Yet something had quietly changed between Lucas and me. The awkward uncertainty that once filled every conversation had disappeared, replaced by a quiet understanding that neither of us needed to explain anymore. One Monday morning, I walked into the staff lounge and immediately noticed the weekly schedule posted on the bulletin board. Out of habit, I looked for my name first. This time, nothing had changed. Every shift I requested remained exactly where I had placed it. There were no handwritten corrections, no exchanged initials, and no sign that Lucas had volunteered to take another overnight assignment. I stared at the schedule longer than I should have before turning toward the nurse's station where Lucas was reviewing patient charts. During a short break between admissions, I walked over and gently tapped the clipboard in his hands. "You forgot to steal my shift this week," I said with a smile. He looked up, and for a second I saw the familiar hint of amusement in his eyes. "No," he answered quietly. "I decided it was time to let you choose your own schedule again." I folded my arms. "That is it. After everything." He nodded. "You know the truth now. If I kept doing it without asking, it would no longer be helping. It would simply be making decisions that belong to you." His answer somehow made me admire him even more. He had never wanted control over my life. He had only wanted to make it a little easier while I needed the help. Now that my grandmother had fully recovered and returned home, he believed his quiet job was finished. That evening, my shift ended just before sunset. As I gathered my backpack, I noticed Lucas preparing to begin another overnight rotation. He reached for his coffee exactly as he always did before checking patient assignments one final time. Before he could walk away, I called his name. He turned immediately. "Do you have plans after work tomorrow?" I asked. He looked genuinely surprised. "Nothing important." I smiled. "Good. Because my grandmother insists that the person responsible for giving her grandson so much extra time deserves one of her homemade dinners." Lucas blinked once, clearly caught off guard. "Ryan, you really do not have to." I gently interrupted him. "I know I do not have to. I want to." For several quiet seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he smiled in a way I had never seen before, warm, relaxed, and completely free of the careful distance he had carried for so long. "Then I would be honored," he said softly. The following evening, we drove together to my grandmother's small house just outside the city. She greeted Lucas as though she had known him for years, insisting he sit beside her at the dinner table while she served homemade chicken pot pie, fresh bread, and the peach cobbler she always made for special occasions. Throughout the evening, she watched us laugh over stories from the hospital, occasionally exchanging knowing smiles whenever one of us finished the other's sentence without realizing it. As we prepared to leave, she quietly hugged Lucas before whispering something only he could hear. He smiled, nodded respectfully, and thanked her. On the drive back to Chicago, I finally asked, "What did she say?" Lucas looked out through the windshield for a moment before answering with a gentle laugh. "She said that some people spend years searching for someone who quietly chooses them every single day." Then she reminded me that I have already been doing exactly that for longer than either of us was willing to admit. Life settled into a rhythm that neither of us had planned, yet both of us quietly appreciated. Mercy General remained just as demanding as ever, with unpredictable nights, endless patient charts, and alarms that never seemed to stop ringing. The difference was that I no longer walked through those hallways feeling alone. Lucas and I naturally found ourselves working the same shifts more often, not because anyone rearranged the schedule, but because we both began requesting similar hours. Every now and then one of the charge nurses would glance at the schedule board, smile knowingly, and joke that the emergency department somehow ran more smoothly whenever both of us were working together. We always laughed it off, but secretly I felt the same way. One rainy Wednesday afternoon, our nurse manager asked if Lucas and I would mentor 3 newly hired nurses during their first week in the emergency department. We agreed without hesitation. Throughout the day, we divided responsibilities almost effortlessly. Lucas calmly explained emergency procedures while I demonstrated patient documentation and equipment preparation. Whenever one of the new nurses looked overwhelmed, Lucas encouraged them with the same quiet patience he had once shown me without my ever realizing it. During our lunch break, one of the trainees smiled and asked, "How long have you two been working together?" Lucas looked toward me before answering, "About a year." The young nurse laughed softly. "It feels much longer. You already know what the other person is thinking before they say anything." Neither of us knew how to respond, But after she walked away, we exchanged amused smiles that quietly admitted she was probably right. That evening, after the department finally became less busy, we walked toward the employee parking garage together. A light rain had started falling again, covering the pavement with shimmering reflections from the hospital lights. Lucas opened an umbrella, holding it naturally, so both of us stayed dry as we crossed the nearly empty parking lot. "You know," I said with a quiet laugh, "a few months ago I would have assumed you were only sharing the umbrella because nobody else was around." Lucas smiled warmly. "And now?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Now I know you would have shared it even if the entire hospital had been watching." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You finally understand me." "I am still learning," I admitted. We reached my car, but neither of us immediately opened the doors. The rain continued falling gently around us, filling the quiet evening with a peaceful rhythm. Lucas rested one hand on the umbrella handle before speaking in a voice that carried none of the careful distance I once associated with him. "Ryan, there is something I should have said a long time ago." I met his eyes, waiting patiently. "I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything," he continued. "Every shift I volunteered for, every decision I made, was simply because seeing you have time with your grandmother mattered more to me than another free evening for myself. I would have been perfectly happy if you never discovered it." I felt an unexpected warmth settle in my chest. "But I am glad I did discover it," I answered honestly. "Because if I had not, I would have spent the rest of my life believing the kindest person I had ever met could not stand me." Lucas smiled with quiet relief before gently reaching for my hand. I met his gesture without hesitation, and for the first time neither of us worried about misunderstandings, assumptions, or unspoken feelings. We simply stood there beneath the umbrella while the rain fell around us, grateful that one ordinary workplace mystery had quietly become the beginning of something neither of us wanted to imagine living without. Spring slowly replaced the last traces of winter, and with it came a feeling that everything at Mercy General was beginning to breathe a little easier. The hospital remained just as busy as ever, but the sunlight pouring through the lobby windows during early morning shift changes somehow made even the longest days feel a little lighter. Lucas and I settled naturally into a routine that no longer required explanations. We still worked professionally, still focused completely on our patients while we were on duty, but outside those responsibilities we found ourselves sharing small moments that quietly became the best part of each week. Sometimes we met for breakfast after finishing overnight shifts before driving home to rest. Other times we stopped at the small cafe across the street from the hospital where the owner had already memorized both of our coffee orders. None of those moments felt extraordinary on their own, yet together they slowly built something stronger than either of us had expected. One Saturday afternoon, Lucas finally invited me to meet someone important in his life. We drove to a peaceful neighborhood on the edge of the city where flowering trees lined quiet streets filled with children riding bicycles and neighbors tending their gardens. His parents welcomed me with the kind of warmth that immediately erased every nervous thought I had carried during the drive. His mother insisted that nobody left her house hungry, while his father proudly showed me old family photographs that covered an entire hallway. Looking through those pictures, I noticed one thing almost immediately. Lucas had always been the same person. Whether he was 10 years old helping his younger cousins decorate birthday cookies or 20 years old standing beside classmates at nursing school, he always seemed happiest whenever someone else was smiling. During dinner, his mother laughed and pointed toward Lucas. He has always tried to solve everyone's problems before they even realized they had one. I smiled knowingly. That sounds familiar. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed grin while everyone else laughed together. Later that evening, after dinner had ended and the dishes were finally put away, his father joined us on the back porch overlooking a quiet backyard filled with blooming flowers. He looked at Lucas before turning toward me with a gentle smile. "You know," he said, "when Lucas first became a nurse, I asked him why he chose such a demanding career. He told me something I have never forgotten." I looked toward Lucas with quiet curiosity. His father continued. He said that sometimes the greatest difference you can make in someone's life is giving them a little more time with the people they love. My chest tightened as those words settled into the evening air. Without realizing it, Lucas had been living by that belief long before we ever met. He had not made room in my schedule because he expected anything in return. He had simply believed that family mattered more than convenience. As we drove home beneath a sky filled with fading shades of orange and blue, I quietly reached for his hand. He smiled without taking his eyes off the road, gently holding mine as though the gesture had always belonged there. In that peaceful silence, I finally understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me since I was a child. The most extraordinary people rarely announce themselves. They quietly change your life one thoughtful decision at a time until one day you realize happiness has been sitting beside you all along. Summer arrived with longer days, warmer evenings, and the familiar rhythm of Mercy General Hospital continuing without pause. New nurses joined the emergency department while others moved on to different specialties, yet Lucas and I remained exactly where we wanted to be. Caring for patients had never become easier, but sharing those demanding days with someone who understood every exhausting shift somehow made even the busiest weeks feel manageable. Before long, people throughout the department stopped asking whether we were spending time together outside of work. They simply accepted it as naturally as they accepted seeing us begin each morning with coffee before walking onto the floor. One Friday afternoon, the hospital organized its annual community health fair in a nearby neighborhood park. Doctors, nurses, therapists, and volunteers spent the day offering free health screenings, answering questions, and teaching families simple ways to stay healthy. Lucas and I were assigned to the same education booth, helping visitors understand basic first aid and preventive care. It was a completely different environment from the controlled urgency of the emergency department. Children laughed while running between activity stations, local musicians played soft acoustic music beneath shaded trees, and families enjoyed picnics across the open lawn. Watching Lucas interact with everyone around him reminded me once again why so many people admired him. He spoke to nervous parents with patience, knelt to answer children's questions at eye level, and somehow made every person feel as though they had his complete attention, even on one of the busiest days of the year. During a quiet moment between visitors, one little boy looked up at Lucas and asked, "Are you and him best friends?" Lucas glanced toward me before smiling warmly at the child. "I think that is a very good place to start." The little boy nodded with complete satisfaction before running back to his family, leaving both of us laughing softly. Later that afternoon, as volunteers began packing equipment into hospital vans, my grandmother arrived carrying a homemade basket filled with cookies she insisted on sharing with the entire emergency department team. Everyone immediately surrounded her, thanking her for the treats while she happily greeted people whose names she somehow always remembered. After several minutes, she quietly walked over to Lucas and placed a small envelope into his hand. "Please open it later," she said with a gentle smile. On the drive back to the hospital, Lucas finally opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note resting beside an old family photograph of my grandmother and me taken when I was a child. He read the letter silently before handing it to me. In careful handwriting she had written, "Thank you for giving my grandson something more valuable than extra time with me. You reminded him that there are people in this world who choose kindness even when nobody is watching. Never forget that you deserve the same kindness in return." Lucas folded the letter carefully before placing it back into the envelope as though it were something precious. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. We simply drove through the warm evening light while the city slowly came into view ahead. Finally, he looked toward me with quiet emotion in his eyes. "Your grandmother has a remarkable gift," he said softly. "She always seems to know exactly what people need to hear." I smiled as the skyline reflected the colors of the setting sun. She told me once that the strongest relationships are not built through extraordinary moments. They are built through ordinary days that people choose to share again and again. As I looked at Lucas beside me, I realized we had already been building exactly that kind of life together, one thoughtful day at a time. Autumn returned to Chicago almost exactly 1 year after I first stood in front of the scheduling board wondering why Lucas Bennett kept taking my shifts. Looking back, it was difficult to believe how much my life had changed because of one misunderstanding I had been too proud to question. Mercy General Hospital still looked the same every morning. The emergency department remained, filled with hurried footsteps, quiet determination, and people giving everything they had to help complete strangers. Yet every time I walked through those familiar hallways, I no longer saw only the pressure and exhaustion. I saw the place where I had learned that the quietest acts of kindness often leave the deepest marks on a person's life. Lucas and I continued working together, but now our schedules reflected choices we made together instead of sacrifices made in secret. Some weeks we selected the same shifts because we genuinely enjoyed working side by side. Other weeks we deliberately chose different hours so one of us could rest while the other carried the workload. The difference was simple but meaningful. Every decision was now shared openly, built on trust instead of silent assumptions. One crisp Saturday morning, before our shift began, Lucas handed me a folded piece of paper while we sat in the hospital cafe. I opened it and immediately recognized the familiar format. It was an official shift exchange request. I looked up in confusion until I noticed he was smiling. "Read the note at the bottom," he said. Beneath the form he had written, "This is the first schedule change I have ever asked your permission to make." I laughed as I continued reading. He was requesting one evening off the following month because his parents were celebrating their wedding anniversary and his entire family would be gathering for dinner. Without saying a word, I signed the request and slid it back across the table. "Approved," I said with a grin. "I think family time is always the right reason." Lucas laughed softly, folding the paper with obvious relief. "I had a feeling you might understand." That evening, after another long but rewarding shift, we walked outside together as the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline. The cool autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves while the hospital lights gradually illuminated the parking lot. Before unlocking my car, I paused for a moment and looked back at the building where everything had begun. "You know," I said quietly, "for months I believed someone was taking something away from me." Lucas turned toward me with a curious smile. I continued, "Now I realize you were giving me something I could never replace. More time with my grandmother. More memories. More chances to be there when she needed me most." He gently shook his head. "You would have done the same for me." I smiled because I knew he was right. Somewhere along the way, his quiet generosity had changed the way I looked at the world. Kindness no longer seemed like something extraordinary reserved for rare moments. It had become a daily choice, one thoughtful decision at a time. As we drove away from the hospital beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and gold, I realized the greatest lesson I carried from that unforgettable year had nothing to do with love arriving unexpectedly or misunderstandings finally being resolved. It was much simpler than that. Sometimes the people who change your life are not the ones who make the loudest promises. They are the ones who quietly stand beside you, ask for nothing in return, and keep choosing your happiness long before you ever realize they have been choosing you all along.